A lot of speculation in social media and other places as to what caused the event. A lot of things that are very unsubstantiated that are being talked about. We wanted to take the opportunity to provide what we know from confirmed information, and maybe provide a little perspective on that, leveraging our research foundations, our subject matter expertise, and particularly leveraging our EPRI Europe team. So we have over 30 power systems researchers that sit in our EPRI Europe team, and they have context of the European systems and subject matter expertise on this. So been looking at it. Just want to set the what we're going to try to get done here in the next 45 minutes. So we are going to give you some overview of sort of the Iberian system and the European system, provide some context based on some historical events and what we understand and know from those systems. We will talk about the confirmed details from the event that happened on April 28th. We won't speculate beyond unconfirmed details, but we'll also talk about the system restoration and what we know about that. And we will, in the end, talk about potential factors that are of general consideration in emerging grids without any indication or intention to suggest that any one factor is the driving factor. So a couple disclaimers. The data that we will be presenting, all of it comes from publicly available information. We know that some of the public systems that we took that data from, such as the ENSO-E transparency platform, data in those systems during an event like this may or may not be correct and is subject to change. So just note that. And we'll say that it's highly limited ability to be able to actually draw conclusions at this stage because of lack of data and information that we do have. So with that, we're going to give you context, and we'll give you some thoughts that we have in terms of what we see in the event, but we are not going to speculate in any way on any unconfirmed specifics there. Red Electrica and others are in the middle of their investigation, and they're going to be providing more information soon. And we don't want to speculate otherwise. So with that, I'm going to actually hand off to Sean McGuinness, who is the lead of all of our EPRI system protection research, who sits in our Dublin office, is very familiar with the continental European system, and has also been involved in several of our blackout investigations that we have done on other systems over the last several years. And Sean is going to lead us through what we know and what we're able to share. As Eamon said, if you have questions, do put those in the Slido, and we'll be addressing those as we go. So with that, Sean, I'm going to hand to you.
Thanks, Daniel. So thanks, Daniel, and thanks everyone for joining. So as Daniel mentioned, we'll be kicking off with a quick overview of Spain and Portuguese grids, and the event from 2021, which kind of gives a lot of context for this event that happened last week. So beginning with Spain, population is about 44 million in Spain. The peak load is approximately 40 gigawatts, about 38 to 40 gigawatts. They have about 25,000 miles of 400 kV and 220 kV networks. So that their 400 kV is their backbone grid. So in the context of that peak load of about 40 gigawatts, they have about 125 gigawatts of installed capacity. So that's spread across solar PV and wind, which have both about 31, 32 gigawatts of installed capacity. Then there's a lot of gas, combined cycle units, hydro, nuclear, and so on. So immediately from this, you can see that Spain is a very high renewables country, and they're one of the leading countries in the world for this, and have a lot of experience in operating grids and developing new solutions to manage that. You can see that they're interconnected to three neighboring countries. There's a capacity of about 2.8 gigawatts to connect to France in the northeast. They are heavily interconnected with Portugal to their west. They can import about 2.1 gigawatts, export just nearly 4 gigawatts. And they also have an interconnector to Morocco in the south, which has between 600 and 900 megawatts of capacity. So they are interconnected to their neighbors. They have a lot of installed capacity, and they do regularly operate the grid with very high penetration of renewables to great success. Prior to this event, they haven't had a large scale blackout on their grid in their 50-year history of the grid, but they have previous under frequency events. Portugal, then, their neighbors, smaller neighbors, there's a population of about 11 million people there. Their peak load is about 9 gigawatts. In contrast to Spain, they have a hydro-dominated system. So for their peak load of 9 gigawatts, they have about 8 gigawatts of hydro. They also have nearly 4.5 gas turbines. Pump storage is a large feature, as well as some solar PV and wind. Large capacity, but that does complement their existing hydro. And again, they're quite well embedded or interconnected to their neighbors in Spain, with multiple 400 kV links between the two of them. So they are quite well meshed, the two grids together. So they do go operate in tandem. Obviously, smaller grids, 6,000 miles or so of transmission network. I guess so. They're the two grids. There was in 2021 a pretty significant event. So they're part of the continental European grid, which is about 500 gigawatt peak load across the entire continent. In 2021, there was a number of wildfires in the southeast of France. Smoke from some of them caused the tripping of a 400 kV line, and about 2 minutes later, the other line on the same circuit also tripped. It was carrying about 2.5 gigawatts of load prior to the event. When the initial line tripped, the operators were taking actions to de-risk and deload the system, but the second line tripped before those actions were completed. And that second tripping led to overloading of the tie lines between France and Spain, and then power swings, and that tripped the connectors in between France and Spain. However, what happened next was probably the more interesting part of that. So after that loss of 2.5 gigawatts plus the remaining interconnectors, there's about 2.6 gigawatts of generators in Spain tripped, on top of the existing loss of imports. But of that 2.6 gigawatts, about 1 gigawatt tripped due to overvoltages. So traditionally, when we see blackouts and cascade tripping, we see synchronous generators tripping due to underfrequency, volts per hertz or overexcitation protection, and out-of-step protection and other protection functions. But it was relatively unusual to see so many generators trip purely due to overvoltages. And we'll explain those in a moment. In response to all of this, they had first and second stages of their under-frequency load shedding system defense activated. Now, a lot of their load shedding first stage comes from pump storage. So they had about 2.3 gigawatts of pump storage in pumping mode at the time, so they could just trip that off. That helped a lot. Then there was a number of industrial customers were also disconnected, and about 3.6 gigawatts of end customers were also shed due to conventional UFLS relay tripping. So in response to an N-2, multiple steps of their system defense plan kicked in. It was able to arrest the decline in frequency, and they were able to restore all of the customers within a few hours, and the system survived, and everything operated pretty much as expected from there. Now, the overvoltages, the reason for those was that initially when the first two 400 kV lines tripped, this resulted in a loss of megavars and a decline in voltage in the northeast of Spain. So you can see from these two charts here on the top left, this shows the voltage profile on the 400 kV grid immediately after those two lines tripped. So you can see that for a nominal voltage of 400 kV, you can see parts of the grid were as low as 337 kV, so it was quite well down. So this persisted. This wasn't a transient dip; it was sustained. So a number of shunt reactors started switching out, and then as the other lines between France and Spain began to trip, and the frequency declined and under-frequency load shedding kicked in, the loss of load combined with the loss of those lines actually drove the voltage up. Now, the shunt reactors had already switched out because of the undervoltage condition. So now we swung from an undervoltage condition to a large overvoltage condition. So you can see on the 400 kV grid, it went up to a peak of about 450 volt kV, so well above their 1.1 per unit maybe limit, or 1.05 per unit normal operating range. So you can see this large swing in voltage was a characteristic of this last event in 2021. And we think this gives a lot of context potentially for the event that happened last week. But we want to emphasize that we don't know what happened for the event last week, but we do think this will be relevant. We do include obviously the links to these reports as well. Also in Spain, for voltage control, pretty much all of the wind and solar plants operate in fixed power factor control mode. So they're not providing actively controlling the voltage at their terminal. They're not sources necessarily of dynamic voltage support. The capability is there and it is required in the grid code, but it is not commonly used, although that may be changing. As a result of that, you can see from these charts, which Red Electrica have previously published, that the 220 kV and 400 kV grids, there are a number of hours every year in recent years where they've been operated above their normal operating range and above their normal operating limits. So you can see quite here, it ranges from 5 hours up to 30 hours per month. Where they're actually operating at or above their normal operating range. So there is quite some challenges in down regulating the voltage in Spain in general. And associated with that, there have been a number of trippings of power plants due to over voltages in recent years, and you can see that trend has been rising over the 2021 to 2023 period. So again, we don't want to speculate on what happened last week, but this is more evidence around just the challenges that exist on the Spanish grid to actively down-regulate voltage and to provide reactive power control. Another topic which has been brought up quite a lot in relation to this event has been oscillations. They're very frequently mentioned in posts on LinkedIn and website news reports and so on. So a little bit of context there. Is that there are a number of known oscillatory modes on the European grid, particularly in the east-west oscillations, which kind of tend to go from Spain over to Turkey. And they're in that kind of 0.15 to 0.21 hertz range, so relatively low frequency. And as a result of that, then we see that they took active measures in Spain to compensate for that. So their power system stabilizers are tuned to try and damp out that frequency range in that 0.1 to 0.3 range to actively damp out those oscillations. There are also oscillations around 0.6 hertz, which are also damped as well. This chart here shows a pretty significant inter-area oscillation, which occurred in 2016. So it is 9 years ago, but it's still relevant. So you can actually see here that the oscillation kicked off. It's had a roughly 0.1 hertz peak-to-peak oscillation range, and it moved around before it was damped out. So it persisted for a number of minutes. So it's about 5 minutes or so, or a little bit less than 5 minutes before it was damped out. So these are one of a number of known inter-area oscillation modes that exist. They've been very well studied and analyzed over time. There's also a north-south mode as well. So inter-area oscillations are not unusual in the European context, although active measures and studies have been taken to try and mitigate them. In addition to this, there's also been a relatively significant change in February, where Latvia and a number of countries in the northeast of Europe desynchronized from the Russian grid and synchronized to the European grid. You may have seen this in the news. So this added about 10 gigawatts of load to the European grid, which is relatively small in the context of a 500 gigawatt system. But it does make the system geographically larger and adds in a number of new power plants as well in the northeast of the grid. That has been well studied, but there is a possibility that there may be new inter-area oscillatory modes that have not been uncovered yet, although we've not seen any of these just yet for this event. So in summary, this is the context for oscillations in the European grid. So they're not unusual, but they do occur.
And Sean, at this point, can we just remind people to put their questions in the Slido? Bottom right, 3 dots, you should see Slido. And if you've got anything, add it in there.
Thanks, Eamon. So this is some of the key context points before we move into the event. So now we're moving into the pre-disturbance system state. So prior to the event, there was about 25 gigawatts of load in Spain, roughly about 8 gigawatts in Portugal. That's just in the peninsular area. For weather conditions, there was no faults. It was sunny. There was no rain. There was some high winds in the south of the peninsula. There was a few warnings in place, but it wasn't abnormal. They had a very rainy spring, so most of their hydro levels were quite high, so they weren't short on hydro. There was no drought or anything like that, so they were well stocked up on that. But it was the outage season was well underway, so there was a number of large generators that are out for their seasonal maintenance. And there was also a significant penetration of behind the meter resources. The exact amount we don't have exact figures for, but it would be relatively substantial in Spain. So you can see that it was operating at a relatively high renewable penetration at the time. To paint a little bit more of a picture about what that dispatch looked like, rather than giving you a large table of results, this stacked graph will give you an indication of the preceding approximately 24 hours. Yellow is solar PV. You can see there that there's also some nuclear in there. There's biomass, wind played a small role, good chunk of hydro storage and gas in there. So there was a mix there, but it was, as you can see, substantially, just prior to the event, it was substantially met by solar PV. And you can also see the way that ramps up in the preceding hours to the event. So just in addition to the large solar PV penetration before the event, they were exporting on all 3 of their connectors to external grids. So there's just prior to the event, we say here that there's 1 gigawatt going to France, but there was actually switching underway just before the event. So that had gone from 1 gigawatt, it was down closer to 0 megawatts immediately prior to the event. And you can actually see here in the left, the change in flow on the connector between France and Spain. So initially it had been Spain exporting to France quite substantially during the night, and that reduced down. But in that kind of like 9 a.m. to 12 noon, you can see that there's actually quite a lot of flow due to market and system operator trades occurring. So there's quite a lot of change on that interconnector before it. So it was roughly 1 gigawatts a few minutes before, and then there was trading that was reducing it close to 0 just immediately prior to the event. So we give that as context to say that it was not operated strictly in steady state, that there was a lot of variation on the interconnectors due to that trading. So we're now going to go into the actual main event itself, and to reiterate what Daniel mentioned earlier, we're presenting the data that we have, and it's extremely important to not just take available data and make conclusions from that. We do have to consider the fact that there's data that we want or that we would like to see, and that you need a full set of data, a full data set to be able to make conclusions about what actually happened. So we don't have voltage profiles across the Spanish grid. We don't know what generators tripped in what sequence. There's a lot of unknowns. So we do really want to emphasize that we're displaying the data that we've discovered and found, but we don't have a complete data set, so we can't make an active conclusion on exactly what happened. But we do want to kind of set the context for what we have available and draw out those to say that are there lessons learned that we can adopt into other grids around the world for maybe something that didn't exactly happen in Spain, but we see this, maybe it raises a concern about this for grids, and to give you that helpful information. So for the event itself, there was a number of trades on the interconnectors and so on. So the grid was in a state of flux. for many minutes before before the actual main event itself. Some of the key events we discovered probably began about 30 minutes before the blackout. And you can see this on the left-hand side. So these are frequency traces taken from UTK, their FNet or their frequency net. So PMUs dotted all around the European grid. So you can see that there's measurements in Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. But at that T-minus 30 minute mark, you can see that there was quite a notable oscillation in frequency in Spain. This oscillation was about 0.2 hertz oscillation, and it persisted for approximately 5 minutes before it was damped out. But you can see it was quite sustained for that 5-minute period until either it was damped out itself or the operators took some actions to mitigate that damping. So that went away, the grid went back to normal. Then 17 minutes prior to the event, a second smaller oscillation began to occur. So the oscillation frequency was about 0.6 hertz, relatively small magnitude, and that persisted for just 2 minutes before damping out. Then at T-minus 19 minutes, we saw the 0.2 hertz oscillation restart again. It was a little bit larger in magnitude, but it did die out after about 2 minutes. And as you can see from this, there was a number of active oscillations. However, oscillations in themselves aren't enough to bring down a grid. So an oscillation in frequency can happen, but you do have to push the grid outside of its normal frequency range in order for protection to actually operate and disconnect devices, or for the oscillation to result in the voltage going out of normal operating range and voltage protection operating. So the oscillations were present. However, it's important to emphasize that you need other parameters to go outside of operating ranges in order for a device to trip and to trigger a cascade tripping. So moving from the minutes then up to 4 minutes before the event began, you can see at pretty much exactly 10:30 there was a sudden drop in frequency. It was relatively small in magnitude, 0.05 hertz, 0.06 hertz. The fact that this happened at almost exactly 10:30, this is in UTC time, which is 12:30 in Spain. Because this happened at almost exactly 10:30, we do suspect that it's a market interval, so it's just some market trading. So there's a market trade that kicked in at 10:30, that changed flows, and that's why we see this sudden change in frequency. So we don't necessarily jump to the conclusion that that was a generator tripping or other event, but it may have been a tripping, but we suspect that that's a market interval. Then moving into really close into the seconds. So we've moved from minutes prior to the event into seconds beforehand. So initially after the event, the blackout occurred, there was a lot of discussions around 2 generators tripping and the consequences of those. In recent days, the Spanish government came out and said there was actually a 3rd tripping, and it began 19 seconds before the blackout. So you can see this little slight dip in frequency, and this was actually a generator that tripped. It doesn't seem to be very large in magnitude, the frequency drop. The bar here is a little bit to the right of where the frequency dip happened, but hopefully you can see it in blue. So it was relatively small in magnitude, maybe 0.01, 0.02 hertz of a drop. So it's relatively easy to miss in this chart. But this was really the first event that occurred. So if this kicked in, this may have activated or triggered other ancillary services to rectify it. We don't know, but this is where the actual event itself began to occur. So the main event really then kicked off as we label it here at t equals to 0 seconds. So this is the first tripping. It's of a large generator in southwest of Spain, and you can see quite a substantial drop in frequency. But you can also see that the Spanish frequency fell a lot faster than the measurements elsewhere in the European grid. So this is where we began to see the loss of synchronism between Spain and between the Iberian Peninsula and Spain and Portugal and the rest of the European grid. So this kind of this opening up of the frequency or loss of synchronism would then trigger power swings and heavy loading of the lines in between the two areas. And then this is where really we begin to see the disturbance really getting going. So after that, about 1.5 seconds after that, then we began to see a number of other events occurring. So between that 1.5 seconds and 5 seconds after the initial event, a number of actions occurred. We don't have clarity on the exact sequence of events. We don't have clarity on exactly which caused the frequency dip that we see in front of us. But what we do know from the press conference that the Spanish government held was that there was a second large generator or loss of power plants in Spain. There was a simultaneous or near simultaneous trip of a large amount or massive amount of renewable energy sources in Spain. There was also then the tripping of the tie lines and interconnectors between France and Spain. And sometime after that, there was also then the tripping of one unit of a nuclear power plant in the south of France. So we don't know if that happened during this event or immediately after it, after Spain and France split. So there was a number of these large events all happening in a relatively small time frame. We don't have exact clarity on the exact sequence of events. We don't have the information to be label each of these individual frequency dips or these oscillations. And but this is we know roughly what happened, but we don't know the sequence. You can see here that really the big frequency decline in Europe began at 1.5 seconds after the tripping in Spain. You can see then that the frequency began to decline quite substantially, but then the frequency in continental Europe, it bounced back quite rapidly. So we think that's probably the tripping of the interconnectors between France and Spain, so that when the initial generation was lost in Spain, there was a lot of power went over reserve from France into Spain. So that dragged down the continental European grid frequency. Then as soon as the France to Spain connectors tripped, then the frequency recovered. Possibly then the nuclear power plant trips in France, we don't know. But this is what we see happened. Then there was also another event in continental Europe at t equals to 18 seconds. That may have been the nuclear power plant. We don't know right now. But you can see here from the evolution of events, there was a lot happening at the same time. So there's a number of potential interferences between these. We don't know exactly. One thing to address also is that you'll see here that the frequency measurement in Spain disappears at 10:33. So this is essentially when the PMU went offline. So that's when it lost its voltage or lost supply. So we don't know if it was on. It could have been on a feeder with under frequency load shedding. It could have been on a feeder that was just disconnected, or some other abnormality. We don't know, but we do know that it lost. We have no measurements after that point. So we don't know exactly what happened in Spain after that, the loss of measurements there. We do know from the press conference, though, that the system was in a system black state at t equals to 5 seconds. So it was very rapidly evolving. There was no way for the system operator to be able to actively respond in that 5-second interval. It was far beyond that. So moving from they're kind of the key facts that we know about the actual disturbance event itself. Obviously, immediately after the blackout occurred, all of the system operators began to kick into restoration mode, assessing what was available, operating breakers, performing the switching, getting crews out to site, and so on. This is the information we have about the Spanish grid restoration. So they pretty much began black start immediately after it, or within minutes. They began reconnecting the ties to France, which is a very rapid way to restore. For some reason, the chart in the bottom right here is not looking too healthy. But in the original version of these slides, we had a chart showing the flows of power between France and Spain. And what basically we could see within the first 2 hours after the blackout, that there was a steady ramp up in power from France to Spain, peaking at about 1,500 megawatts. So that happened quite quickly. So they were able to use those megawatts from France to begin re-energizing the grid. In parallel with that, bringing most of their hydro units on to start energizing the grid. and after the immediate black start from the hydros, then bringing the combined cycle units and then restructuring and rebuilding the grid. Black starting an entire 40 gigawatt grid from scratch is obviously not easy. Has a lot of switching actions, a lot of operators, a lot of coordination between different between the system operator, distribution operators, and other significant entities and stakeholders. So it took about 9.5 hours to get 62% of the substations re-energized. And all of the substations were restored after about 15.5 hours. So in the context of a approximately 40 gigawatt grid at peak, this is kind of how long that it took them to actually restore everything. We don't have exact data points for their exact sequence, but from those that are made available, we have this chart in the top right that shows we go from 0 megawatts up to 100%. After about 24 hours or just under 24 hours, when 100% of the load was connected. In Portugal, then they actually have two main black start resources. In the north, they have a combined cycle unit that's 330 megawatt gas turbines, steam turbine sets, and in the middle of Portugal, they have 346 megawatt hydros. So they were able to bring those into action again, began within minutes. Obviously, they're a smaller grid, but they still have a lot of switching to do. So they're able to restore about 96% of their transmission substations within about 10 hours. And it took about 12 hours to get all of their load reconnected. So pretty much by just after midnight or local time, the load was fully restored. So to rebuild all of that network was pretty impressive to get everything back so quickly. So that's really a brief summary of the context of the pre-event situation, but the oscillations, the event itself from the large units that tripped the massive disconnection of renewable resources, going on to system separation between France and Spain, ultimately the collapse in the grid, and then the restoration of the Spanish and Portuguese grids. At this point, I would love to be able to give this is exactly why everything happened. This is why everything tripped. These are the lessons learned. We do not have the information to make those conclusions. And we don't want to speculate on them or to prejudice any investigation that might happen. So really at this point, we want to kind of look at past events and what we know about this event and kind of draw out some factors that we might want to learn from other grid standpoints for how to manage issues and challenges. We've seen from the 2021 event that voltage control was a substantial part, played a substantial role in the event. So, you know, if you're an event in a grid which is undergoing rapid changes in energy sources, it's very important to consider voltage controls, both static and dynamic, and ensuring that there's sufficient reactive power capability and that you're leveraging the available capabilities as well. And that you're aware of those, which reactive power sources you're using, which ones are at their limits, and any issues that may arise. How sensitive is your grid, or how close is your grid to initiating cascade tripping? How sensitive are you to managing elevated voltage conditions on your grid? And how many devices or resources tripping would it take to then begin initiating cascade tripping? Something we saw from the 2021 event, and we've seen in other grids as well, is that around protection coordination. Usually that's transmission grid protection coordination, but really what we've seen here is that we, through interconnection requirements and grid codes, we set fault right through envelopes for voltages. And within those, we might say that, okay, you need to remain connected at, to 0.88 per unit voltage up to 1.1 per unit voltage for a certain amount of time, maybe a second or more. And then really on the power plant side, they don't see that as the minimum. They see that, well, if I'm going to set my overvoltage protection, what's my requirement, and set a small margin to that. But unfortunately, if everyone in the grid basically sets their protection to immediately meet your envelope, then that can create a common mode failure because the overvoltage protection is not coordinated. So you have an overvoltage and all the units that see that will all trip at pretty much the same time because they're all trying to meet your grid code or interconnection requirement. So in some grids, or we've seen elsewhere in the world, you have situations where a prolonged undervoltage or a prolonged overvoltage condition can actually result in the disconnection of more power plants than your standard large loss of largest infeed assumption. So if you assume that maybe 2 or 3 gigawatts is your largest infeed, you can have that or more disconnecting for a sustained abnormal voltage event. So this isn't to say that every power plant should have a different voltage set point, but it is recognizing it as a potential common mode failure that if a part of a grid does experience a high or low voltage, how exposed are the power plants in the area to potentially all tripping near simultaneously in response to that. So as I say, it's power plant coordination and also recognizing that this has to be coordinated with each other. Oscillations, as I mentioned earlier, there were certainly oscillations in the minutes leading up to the event, but oscillations in themselves don't necessarily cause blackouts. But if you do have oscillations that result in abnormal voltage or abnormal frequency or angular instability, then that can potentially lead to protection relays tripping, be it voltage or frequency protection tripping as designed, or potentially if it's large enough in magnitude or angular instability, distance protection can potentially trip. But the important thing to recognize there is oscillations in themselves can cause abnormalities, but you do have to push the grid outside of its normal operating envelope for that to happen. And this is something we look forward to finding out about more when the report is published next week into what those oscillations looked like and potentially how they impacted on other power plants. However, in your context, you probably know your existing oscillatory modes that are on your grid, whether they're damped or how well damped they are, but also recognizing that the impacts they can have. We put in here synchronizing torque, which personally I feel that does maybe it gets it's kind of in the shadow of inertia. Everyone talks about inertia being the problem, but when you're are operating a grid with a lot of grid following resources from inverters and you're reducing the number of synchronous generators, it's important that those synchronous generators that they are tied together, and it's synchronizing torque is what keeps those in synchronism. If there's 2 generators and they're very remote from each other, if one trips, the other may not respond quickly and you can have a loss of synchronism. So recognizing how well synchronous generators are tied together on your grid is in many ways as important or more important than simply looking at inertia itself for how fast frequency will change in the grid, but how fast can the grid actually lose synchronism or split apart. We also recognize that ride-through capability and ride-through performance in particular are challenges. There's been a number of major events, particularly in North America, around power plants not riding through sustained undervoltage events or faults. In this case, obviously we don't know what happened, but there's quite well defined ride-through requirements. But recognizing those and in coordination with the protection coordination, having a ride-through requirement is vitally important, but recognizing then how the plants may respond to it is just as important. And finally, inertia. So many grids which operate with high renewable resources, they set inertia floors. And really setting an inertia floor is around limiting the maximum rate of change of frequency and to de-risk the loss of synchronism. But that's really a high level capture to ensure that your grid remains stable. There's many ones underneath that, such as synchronizing torque to ensure that your grid is actually stable and won't split apart. And again, to emphasize, the extent to which any of these factors contributed to the April 28 event is not known. And we're not saying any one of these was the cause or the trigger, but we want to give them as context and lessons learned for your own grids to maybe to review where you are and identify if any of these are potentially an important factor you may want to revisit or look at on your own grid if you haven't done so in detail already. So really, to wrap up and kind of summarize the general consideration for these evolving grids, grids everywhere are becoming more complex. There's greater variability, greater uncertainty, and as your resource mix changes, it's vitally important to consider dynamic system. These dynamic systems require reliability, and their resources, in some cases that may be faster controls. It also ensures that we need improved coordination of protection. So not just transmission line protection, but our voltage protection, frequency protection, rock off, and so on, to ensure that in response to an event, we get controlled tripping and that we can bring the system back into normal operating ranges and that we don't initiate a cascade tripping of multiple power plants. In many grids, it's very hard to build new transmission lines and we push our existing infrastructure as far as we can. But to remain safe and reliable, we need to look at these types of situations. And this feeds into kind of ensuring that we have more rigorous reliability standards and security assessments, both in the planning domain, the real-time operational planning, and real-time operations itself, to cater for these kind of dynamic or complex grids. We've already mentioned dynamic reactive power support and synchronizing torque as both being very critical, especially as you get changes in resource mixes. And finally, I will always say this as a protection engineer, power plant protection and control should be coordinated to avoid these cascade tripping events. In addition to, we've already many grids focus on ensuring that transmission line protection has loadability limits and that they have power swing blocking or so on, that they don't respond to power swings. But also in our power plants, we need to look at ensuring that their voltage and frequency protection is coordinated to avoid triggering these types of cascade events. So that's essentially where our summary of where we are right now and our understanding of it and based on the available data.